Free trade good, free trade bad. There appears to have been a lot of confusion, generalizations, and completely dubious claims made about free trade since the word's creation. So what exactly is it? This, I think, many people know, because the idea is simple enough. No restriction of trade, removal of tariffs for goods flowing over administrational borders, normally national ones. So the confusion is not in the term itself, but more regarding what free trade supposedly does. It has been accused of everything from job creator, job destroyer, the means of removing poverty, to the oppressor of it, and almost everything in between. But it actually only does exactly what it states. It allows the free flow of goods across national borders. So how can this simple action be labelled with these supposedly contradictory consequences? Because of the way it allows two different, formerly partially insulated economies to suddenly interact. It depends on the specific circumstances of these two economies, the rules and conditions of these two economies, that will dictate the consequences of the free trade for both parties. It is very important to note one thing at this point, something that does not often get considered when discussing free trade in general. Labour is what individuals trade. It is tradable for goods and services, but must be allowed to physically move and offer itself to different providers to be considered free. The free movement of goods between borders should, by definition, be matched by the ability of labour to move across borders. Otherwise, you are freeing only a component of trade, restricting the trade in labour across borders while allowing the trade in goods and potentially capital. So, in the world today, there is only one real example of something approaching true free trade between nations, and that is the part of the EU that allows citizens to live wherever they want. Now, not to say that the EU is not without its faults, and that there are no detractors of the freedom of movement of people within it, but here you can see how true free trade reacts when labour is allowed to migrate. When there is a large disparity between opportunity, people migrate. If there is little difference in opportunity and freedoms, people mostly stay put. In countries of relatively similar opportunities, laws, education standards and freedom, there is little movement. This is important because it helps explain why two countries with a free trade in products but not labour run into the issues they do. Let's take this idea a little further so that one can more easily see the correlation. Say, for example, that in one country you have one group of people, while in the other you have a population that is significantly more controlled, less educated, poorer, or a mixture thereof. So, without freedom of movement, a population is effectively a prisoner in a national-sized prison. You have no choice but to work in this place even if you don't like the conditions. You have to work by their rules. This disparity normally translates into the less developed country suffering from more corruption, less health and safety regulation, less environmental regulation, or a mixture thereof. In the end, it always equates to worse labour conditions or quality of life for the worker, be it through worse pay, unsafe and unhealthy work environment, or degradation of natural resources, lack of freedoms, etc. Now, if there was freedom of movement, many people would not put up with this. If the difference between the two countries was large, they would immigrate en masse to the place with better living and working conditions in significant numbers, so much so that those left behind would have greater bargaining power versus the government and work providers to demand better working and living conditions, or they would just migrate as well. Notwithstanding what kinds of issues such mass migration in the modern world would cause, you can see that the restriction of movement simply traps a labour force within a controlled environment, under often significantly worse labour conditions than those in the more developed countries. So now you have some very dirty, labour-intensive, polluting or dangerous works that need doing. In the more developed countries, you have to provide training and all kinds of safety procedures which cost time and money. You have to meet environmental regulations and pay a premium for people to do such works. Or you can just export this work to a country with fewer regulations, and regulators who can more easily be bribed. Workers that have no bargaining power due to being uneducated, and in mass supply due to the demographical and socioeconomic circumstances of the country. And most importantly, these workers cannot move. So workers must compete on a forced, uneven playing field. Forced because they cannot move. Only capital and goods can move, and goods don't talk about their history. The country with the cheaper working conditions will end up producing almost everything, not because they have a natural geographic advantage, not because they are cleverer or want to work for less. It is because they have a labour force that has to work for less, has to work in dirty and dangerous conditions. They simply don't have a choice because they cannot move. What we get from this is what we get today. All manufacturing jobs moving to the country with cheaper working conditions, cheaper products flooding the market of the developed countries, and the transfer of wealth to the less developed country. In the end, the former rich country can no longer trade anything because it doesn't produce anything anymore. It is just not competitive. Its only alternative is to lower the conditions of its workers and regulations to try and match those of the less developed country. And this is often not practicable, leading to social unrest and possibly even collapse. In the meantime, the workers of the less developed countries have paid a heavy price for their lifting out of poverty, working dismal and dangerous conditions for minimum wage because they have no alternative, while their country and environment has suffered immensely for the privilege of being the world's unregulated factory. So who benefits? Money lenders mostly. They mostly only care about profits and growth. As money can move across borders more easily, they have long since moved their capital to the developing countries, where the better conditions for the owners and poorer labour conditions increase profit margins. The mid-complex manufacturing industries in the more developed country may also have been seduced by the lure of having a competitive advantage by getting a component of their stock from a cheaper country, but is only a matter of time until they too are swallowed up as the developing countries' industries expand in complexity and products, eventually bankrupting one after the other up the chain, who only years before profited from this free trade, until they themselves had a direct competitor in the less developed country. And the people? They were easily seduced by the mass of cheap products temporarily increasing their standards of living, or material wealth, by any measure of imagination, until they one day can no longer afford to pay for even these cheap products, because too many have lost their jobs to their much cheaper competitors overseas when they started producing what they themselves used to produce. In the end, the big winners are the financiers, because their capital is still producing mass profits overseas, off the backs of foreigners, while the developed country, many of them originated from, people get more in debt, attempting to maintain previous living standards. They can then buy up everything once these poor souls with deteriorating labour conditions and wages get into difficulty. The other big winner, eventually even more so, are the corrupt officials of the developing country. Without the freedom of movement, they have their cheap labour all stitched up, and they quickly learn from the financiers how to play the game, and soon enough have their own capital to invest. All they need to do is keep the original financiers sufficiently compensated to maintain the uneven working playing field with the developed country, because this is still the most profitable arrangement. So yeah, free trade. But I did say it was good as well, and indeed it is. It works as advertised when between countries of similar regulations, laws, and to some extent wealth. So, similar labour conditions and quality of life. Not to say that with these conditions alone there are no issues, but unless there is some form of playing field distortion between the countries, it is on the whole beneficial, and very much so in the long term. The safeguard of this is freedom of movement of labour. This will help to even out the playing field if there are any major differences in quality of life and labour conditions. So there is actually a very simple rule when determining if a free trade agreement is beneficial or not for both parties. Would you also allow the free movement of labour over borders? If not, then you have issues. If definitely not, then you have major issues. You have a very uneven playing field for the worker. This cannot work in the long term. Tariffs against products produced by countries with similar regulations, laws, and labour conditions make the workers' playing field more uneven and are not desired. Tariffs against countries that destroy their environment, oppress their people, and have vastly deteriorated labour conditions that ensure your workers are at a massive disadvantage and must lose in the long run, even the playing field for the worker in the developed country. Tariffs are for the worker, not the work providers, and must only ever even the playing field of the workers. So how about those people that claim there is no other way to reduce poverty in a country without trade and the lifting out of poverty by the forced path of awful labour conditions to pay for prosperity? Well, an obvious alternative is to first have the much more free movement of labour before the free movement of goods. Many people from the developing country would flock to the developed country to earn money and get skills, making money for themselves and the local economy. If poverty and lack of skills was the only disparaging factor between these two countries, after some time the vast majority of them will return to their own country to invest this capital in local businesses and trades. Likewise, controlled trade will ensure they can still gain capital goods they need without hurting the workers of the developed countries and their own workers. Capital investment can still be encouraged, but the aim is to have all growth internally in the country or free trade bloc, and not because of exports back to the developed countries. I say trade blocs because free trade benefits all those that have similar labour conditions, laws and regulations, and ideally free movement of labour. Africa, Asia, the Middle East, South and Middle America, Europe, etc. all would benefit from a few large free trade blocs between members of similar socio-economic development and freedom of labour movement. This would considerably aid reducing poverty and instability. If you are not willing to allow the free movement of labour in addition to the free movement of goods and capital, ask yourself why. Because odds on, any significant uneven playing field in labour conditions will result in a long-term disadvantage for the workers of the more developed countries, if the free movement of labour is not there to correct it. I hope, if nothing else, this quick discussion has brought to people's attention the importance of the freedom of movement in labour in discussion of any idea of free trade, and that this concept gets more consideration moving forward. I hope it was of interest. Until next time.